I've roughly ordered them by cost. And the cheapest way, in many ways, is what I call thorough negative testing. Basically, create tests that are designed to fail. It is an unfortunate truism, especially in the software world, that typically you only test for success. I expect this data and I get the expected answer. Well, what happens when I give you data that shouldn't be accepted? Well, I'll accept that too. Whoops, that's a problem, okay? So we really need to be testing for things that shouldn't be accepted to make sure they're not accepted. An approach that's remarkably inexpensive is something called fuzzing with address checking. Turns out that the Heartbleed vulnerability involved accessing memory that wasn't supposed to be accessing. There are tools to actually detect these sorts of things. They slow down performance, which is why they're not widely used in deployed systems. But there's no reason not to use them when you're testing. The Firefox and Chrome developers, for example, already use this kind of approach in developing their software. So you could test with this fuzzing approach, sending it lots and lots of malformed data, and then look to see, did anything cause an access to memory that wasn't supposed to? I'm going to skip number 3. Number 4 is basically there are certain kinds of manual spot checking. The code actually was reviewed by 2 people before it was accepted. Neither the original author nor the reviewer caught the original problem. But if they had had a checklist, think of a pilot for a plane, of do this before you accept in, that would help. And it's not that pilots are stupid or they can't fly a plane. We hopefully are only letting pilots fly planes when they know how to do it. But we give them checklists to help them remember the long list of things they need to look for. Codenomicon used an approach, which I'm numbering number 5, fuzzing with output examination. Traditional fuzzers just look for program crashes. They extended the idea to look more precisely at what the results were to make sure they met certain criteria. And that was actually enough to find it. There are various other approaches. Safer languages, most programming languages don't allow this kind of vulnerability. Of course, the 3 of the 4 most common ones do, okay? Thorough human reviews and audits, that's what Google used to find. They were the first ones to find this, but it takes time to do that. And finally, formal methods. My point here isn't really this list. My point here is that anytime you find a systemic problem, step back. Why did that happen? Go fix. Feedback. We heard some interesting things this morning about how brains learn. I thought that was incredibly fascinating. And we need to have our systems, in a sense, learn as well. So there are some preconditions for some of the techniques that I'm talking about that are necessary to make them work. So I'm just going to very, very briefly describe them here. First of all, simplifying software itself. Oftentimes when we have software developed, we focus a whole lot more on the functionality. Does it work? But when you try to make things work quickly, you often build up what is sometimes referred to as a technical debt. The code's much more complicated than it needs to be, and so on. And a little bit of technical debt, I think, is quite normal. Just like buying a house, you often can't buy the house outright. If I can bring in my cash and buy a house outright, I would, but I probably don't have that. But allowing too much technical debt is a whole lot like buying everything on credit cards and ignoring the totals. Okay? Eventually, too much complexity makes it very, very difficult to successfully make sure that the software only does what's supposed to and not anything else. Simplifying the interfaces, similar issues. Basically using standards as much as possible is really the next two. First of all, some of the techniques for countering them depended on using standard methods for acquiring memory and allocating it properly. Turns out there are some great tools, but they only work if you use the standard approaches. You create your own internal system, and those tools no longer work. And a lot of people weren't aware of this. I'm modifying my teaching materials when I teach how to develop secure software, specifically to note this because I don't know anybody who's ever noted this before as an issue. And finally, it turns out one of the challenges with OpenSSL is it uses this really unusual, it's an open source software program, but it uses a very weird, unusual license. This causes some trouble for reuse. And really, there's a short set that most people use, and you're much better off if you just use one of the short set ones. So, what have we learned? Well, several things, okay? First of all, if you are developing or evaluating software or involved in software development in some way where a vulnerability like Heartbleed would be unacceptable, okay? You need to include at least one approach that would counter it. And if you're evaluating such software, you want to ask, have you included at least one technique that would have countered that sort of thing? A lot of organizations have a lot of approaches for finding vulnerabilities, but they simply aren't effective. There's a systemic problem, and I'll argue basically we need to up our game. We can up our game. There's lots of approaches available, but we need to make sure that if our processes are not adequate, that we fix them. It turns out that this is not just a problem for OpenSSL. It turns out that there's a number of software components that implement this SSL TLS protocol. That's what, again, if you use a web browser, you see the little lock symbol, that's what's getting invoked. Turns out there's been a large rash of major vulnerabilities in many of the libraries used to implement this particular protocol. OpenSSL, of course, was one with Heartbleed. Not that long ago, Apple iOS, in fact, I guess it was a month earlier, Apple iOS had a vulnerability in the same kind of component, which two go-to fails, one after the other. I've even seen T-shirts, go to fail. That's what that's about. It's not identical component, but it's the same kind of component performing the same kind of job. The Apple iOS one and GNU TLS had another vulnerability, had also a major vulnerability. In both Apple iOS and GNU TLS, the vulnerabilities, although are different in some details, fundamentally were the same thing. They're in terms of how you exploit it. They check to make sure that certain things called digital certificates are valid. Okay? The Apple and the GNU TLS ones took valid certificates and said, yes, that's great. They would also take invalid certificates and say, yes, that's great. Wait a minute, that's not great. Okay? The whole point of these things is to check if they're valid and then use them properly. And the fundamental problem here is that we've got a lot of software developers and organizations who are only thinking about positive tests. When I give everything correct and good information, does it work properly? There apparently were no tests to what happens if I give it invalid data. None at all. Because any test actually would have detected this. Almost any test would have detected that. And yet they're not doing them. So these simple failures suggest that in general there's a systemic problem in the software industry, that we're doing mostly positive testing. We're only giving it good data and we're expecting goodness. This is worthless for security. We need to give it data that we don't want it to accept and make sure it rejects it. Okay? Think in terms of password protocols, a login screen. If I put in your name and password and they're correct and it accepts me, that's great. I better see a test that I put in the wrong password and it rejects me. And that's what we're not testing. We're only testing good stuff. Not okay. FIPS 140-2 is it's actually a specification. NIST has a process for evaluating cryptographic modules. What was not obvious to a lot of folks at the time was that the NIST process evaluates cryptographic modules, but they do not evaluate cryptographic protocols. So they evaluate OpenSSL, but not this portion of it. And many other folks are saying, well, who evaluates crypto things? Oh, that's FIPS's job. So in many ways, this was a seam problem. One organization says, I'm not evaluating it. The other organization says, well, they do it. No one's looking. Okay? Again, systemic problems here, and we need to examine those. I've already talked to the NIST folks who are not making any commitments right now, but they're fully aware of the problem and are looking into ways that perhaps things can be made better. A third point, and I guess this is more specific to this particular topic, is I think there needs to be a free libre open source software protocol test suite for this particular area, because this is an area that's really important. There's actually a large number of implementations of these things, but testing them, everybody basically builds their own local tests, and frankly, none of these test suites are all very good. What we really need to do is pool those resources to create better tests that can be tested for everybody using some of the techniques that I listed there. And really what I'm thinking about here is getting a test suite out to the developers so that they can test not just 3 years later after everybody's deployed it everywhere, but test it every time a change is made so that by the time it's fielded, we've got a much better handle and much more confidence that the software does what it's supposed to do and doesn't do what it's not supposed to do. I mean, simple things like it accepts valid certificates and accepts invalid certificates is one of those things that's remarkable to miss ahead of time, but it was, and more than once, by more than one organization. So, I guess my bottom line here is hidden, the big box on the bottom, right? Fundamentally, ideally, we would always understand our content correctly the first time. I don't think that's realistic. What we can do is learn from past systemic problems to prevent repeating them, and I think what that involves is identifying what those systemic problems is, identifying your options, picking at least one of those, and going from there. And I think that's a reasonable way to conclude, so thank you very much.